Good afternoon, and welcome to the fourth Scarlet Scholars Series lecture featuring Patrick Rosal, Professor of English and co-director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. My name is Howard Marcatello of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in Camden. Together with the Office of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving, it is our pleasure to present this series, which gives a platform to our faculty to share their research with a wide audience. We are excited for today's lecture, and I'm pleased to announce that on December 2nd, University Professor Margaret Marsh will present our second fall 2021 Scarlet Lecture. And stay tuned for information about our spring series. Today's lecturer is Patrick Rosal, Professor of English and co-director of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice. Professor Rosal heads the Quilting Waters Initiative, an ongoing public art experiment at the intersection of race and ecology that gathers stories of water from around the world and that will culminate in collaborations with local Camden artists. Author of 5 full-length poetry collections, including The Last Thing, New and Selected Poems, Professor Rosal has received fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Fulbright Research Scholar Program. His writing and visual work has been published in the New York Times, The Nation, eFlux, and many other journals and magazines. A winner of the Lenore Marshall Prize from the American Academy of Poets, he has performed as poet and musician in Europe, Africa, Asia, and throughout the Americas at venues that include the Lincoln Center, NJPAC, and the Cabrillo Housing Projects for Agricultural Workers, comprising a writing and performance career spanning more than 20 years. This afternoon, Professor Rosal will present Race, Climate, and the Communal Imagination. This lecture will address how poetry prepared him to think about racial justice in the context of community and place. He will also share some ongoing collaboration work with the Quilting Waters Project. Again, thank you for being with us today. And please join me in our virtual welcome of Pat Rosal. Pat?
Thank you, Howard. I just wanted to thank you, Howard, for the invitation to speak today. And I want to thank the Alumni Association also for this invitation to speak a little bit about what I've been working on and what I've been thinking about. I noticed that there's some friends in the audience and some alum that I knew when I was in college, including Michelle Rotorado, and then there's who's a Rutgers alum, and then a couple of alums from our MFA program, Malik Abdo, whose book All the Stars Aflame is coming out next year with Get Fresh Books, and Micaiah Johnson is in the audience, who is also an alum from our MFA program and is a New York Times best-selling author, as well as a PhD candidate at Vanderbilt. So this is it's nice to see some familiar names, if not your faces, over Zoom. So I got a plan today. Just want to make sure that I'm cool with time. The plan is for me to read a couple of poems, and then I want to did a little meditation over the last couple of weeks about how my upbringing and how poetry has prepared me to start thinking about the intersections of race and ecology. And I want to talk a little bit about the Quilting Water Initiative that I'm doing under the auspices of the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice, a new institute that spans the university, all 3 university campuses, and which is executive directed by Michelle Stevens. And then if there's time, and if it's too quiet, I might finish with another poem. So let me open with a couple of poems that'll set the tone and touch on a couple of the themes that I want to talk about today. Typhoon Poem. Is a poem about a story that I heard when I was in the Philippines during one of the worst storms, Typhoon Ondoy in 2009. Typhoon Poem. The teacher can't hear the children over all this monsoon racket. The zillion spoons whacking the rusty roofs. The wicked tin streams flipping full-grown bucks off their hooves. Everywhere there used to be a river, there's a bigger river now. Every hard face on the block is sopping. Even the court where girls from St. Ignominius ran the roughneck boys off to play their own 3-on-3 in plaid skirts and church shoes for cash. Forget it. The whole city's a flash flood with brawn enough to flush trucks sideways down the capital's widest drives. The crushed tonnage bobs around a bit at the foot of some Spanish bastard statue before it stalls and pools on white church steps. Brute pilgrims face it. Paddling dogs won't make it. So children got no shot. But quick thinking, this teacher lashes her students 2 at a time with wire and stray twine. She binds them across their breasts to trees and metal posts lining the streets, half-flooded walk. No goddamn way, she swears. She won't let one little one be washed out, even if their wriggling makes their armpits bleed. They'll have to make peace with the vision of their uncles and neighbors' blue bodies bumping past before they fishtail out of sight. You can't wish away the deluge. You can't vanish the bloated carnage waters, but the tykes in crew cuts and pigtails still fastened to shafts and trunks in ragged rows will survive. For now, their teacher has made them safe by building an orchard of them in the middle of a city road. This small chorus of young, hard fruit, this little grove moaning. And read one more. This is called Brocart, Just Like That. And this is for all the Bill Withers fans out there, and everybody who's had to turn to music after a heartbreak. My last book I wrote after a pretty tough breakup. So, Brocart, Just Like That. When the bass drops on Bill Withers' Better Off Dead, it's like 7 a.m. And I confess I'm looking over my shoulder once or twice just to make sure no one in Brooklyn is peeking into my 3rd floor window to see me in pajamas I haven't washed for 3 weeks. Before I slide from sink to stove in one long groove, left foot first, then back to the window side with my chin up and both fists clenched like 2 small sacks of stolen nickels, and I can almost hear the silver hit the floor by the dozens when I let loose and sway a little back, and just like that, I'm a lizard grown, 2 new good legs on a breeze bent limb. I'm a grown-ass man with a 3-day wish and 2 days to live. And just like that, everyone knows my heart's broke and no one is home. Just like that, I'm water. Just like that, I'm the boat. Just like that, I'm both things in the whole world rocking. Sometimes sadness is just what comes between the dancing. And bam, my mother is dead. And bam, my brother's children are laughing. Just like I can't pop up from my knees so quick these days, and no one ever said I could sing, but tell me my body ain't good enough for this. I'll count the aches right now, one in each ankle, the sharp spike in my back, this mud muscle throbbing in my going bones. I'm missing the 6 biggest screws to hold this blessed mess together. I'm wind rattled, the wood splitting, the hinges are falling off. When the first bridge ends, just like that, I'm a flung open door. So that's a couple of poems, one about water and one about dancing, and those are sort of two of the things that are gonna come through a little bit in my talk today. And I was actually thinking of Muriel Rukeyser's own essay on the education of a poet, and so what I want to outline is a little bit of my own biography and my interactions and my cultural influences, and maybe lead you a little bit to my thinking around the design of Quilting Water as a public art initiative. I was born in Belleville, New Jersey, to a father who left the priesthood just weeks before I was born, and a mother who was a dietitian at Beth Israel Hospital in Newark, the first in her family to go to college. And in writing down my origin now, I realized that this one sentence contains the 3 conditions of my early life that made me a poet: my mother's immigration, my father's religion, and my birth and upbringing in New Jersey. My family moved when I was still a toddler to an industrial suburb, the southern end of Edison in Middlesex County, with the Revlon Cosmetics warehouse across the street from the baseball field we used to play at, and Owens, Illinois, the plastics manufacturer up a little way from there, as well as Fetter's Air Conditioning and American Can up closer to South Main Street. If you headed up Old Post Road in the opposite direction, the Ford auto plant was up on Route 1. Our street was entirely white and working class, while the next street over was almost entirely comprised of Black families. And in one of the big apartment complexes behind the local bar, there were families from Puerto Rico who had crossed the Hudson from the Bronx. I lived in a place and time when I could go to the post office or DMV or racetrack with my dad and hear Spanish, Italian, Hungarian, or Russian, not to mention the dozen varieties of Black and immigrant English. It was a place where I had to navigate difference all the time. You have to understand that we were the only Filipino family in our neighborhood. It's not insignificant to mention here that both my parents arrived in the US in the era between the Tidings-McDuffie Act and the 1965 federal immigration legislation. My parents were aliens. You might know that Filipinos were not always aliens exactly. After the US invaded the archipelago in 1898 and took the islands as an American possession, Filipinos were considered nationals, which allowed the agricultural industry to ship men from the Pacific archipelago to Hawaii and the West Coast and use them as laborers on pineapple and sugarcane plantations and large farming and canning operations from Alaska through the Pacific Northwest and into Southern California. My grandfather was a cicada. That's to say, he was among the young men who boarded a boat from Manila to Honolulu to cut sugarcane in 1929. Americans in that era feared Filipinos would establish families and communities. So it was rare for women to be shipped over from the islands. Without women from their homeland, the farm laborers, known as manongs, an honorific for an older male family member, began to socialize in clubs where they would dress to the nines and dance with white women. When white majority towns began to take notice of the brown dandies, there were riots targeting Filipinos. They were rendered an economic, sexual, and moral threat. In 1934, the US passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, taking away their status as nationals and making them aliens, a category given to my parents when they arrived. Many of the Filipinos who make up communities in the Northeast arrived 2 and 3 decades later. And so virtually every moment of my childhood in the 70s and 80s was an experience of navigating cultural difference. It's not lost on me that all of us now are experiencing a profound sense of separation from one another. I grew up with that feeling. The alienation of the 21st century isn't unfamiliar to me. I had to make sense of a lot of broken pieces as a boy. I think deep down, I was looking for more than a place for my story to make sense. I somehow knew that my story was made up of a lot of stories, and those stories were made up of people and places who looked and sounded very different from one another. They looked and sounded very different from me. I think I must have spent a lot of time trying to figure out which was the right story, that knowing the right story would tell me what path to follow, how to make the right decisions, how to be safe. But there had to be a story where all these different stories could fit. There were tastes, textures, smells, images, and sounds that I took in from my own neighborhood, from my parents' kitchen, that gave me great pleasure, that confounded me, that excited me and moved me, which seemed not to have a place in the single story forms I encountered in the movie theater, or on TV, or in school books. By the time hip hop had become a national craze, Filipinos had been on American dance floors for more than half a century, sometimes at the risk of their own lives. Me and my friends made mixtapes, gathering sounds from the radio and our parents' record collections. We spliced together James Brown, Fania percussion breaks, Martin Luther King speeches, children's songs, folk tunes of our parents' birthplace. We listened to everything, tracing sonic textures through time, experimenting what might happen if we put two sounds together that we had never heard before. Could it make us laugh? Could it heal our young heartbreaks? Could it woo us, excite us, relax us? Could we rock to it? Could we bounce? Could we groove? In short, could we be moved? By the time I was 13, the dance floor became a kind of home for me. A profound discovery for a young man, a boy, really, who may not have always felt at home at his school desk, at the playground, on the street, and maybe not even in his mother's kitchen. The dance floor was a place where I could put all my confusion and love and prayer and anger and sorrow and exuberance and desire. And it was a place where I could join other people, sometimes people much older than me, sometimes younger, often people of different skin color and who spoke a different English or a different language altogether. The dance floor was among the first places I learned to listen and to respond to what I was listening to. It was a ritualistic space that could hold so many other rituals, from folk story to Bible passage, to news headline, to gossip. The dance floor was perhaps the first text I felt empowered to help construct. The dance floor was my first literature. At the Chicago Humanities Festival in 1991, Toni Morrison said this in her keynote. Our lists of priorities in the nation seldom include how to function in disparate communities. Disparate communities, not clubs or teams. How to be alone and competent in solitude. How to nurture friendship rather than how to network. How to approach and perceive beauty, not how to sell, collect it, or exclude it from others. How to inhabit the body, not reconstruct, decorate, or simply medicate it. How to discriminate among various truths and their claims. How to narrate the self. How to articulate and inform one's own experiences, not how the self is spoken of, but how it speaks its own existence without erasing another's. Most importantly, how to think about the quality of life. How to receive tremendous joy from problem solving when the problems to be solved involve the improvement of real lives lived here on this planet. How to discover one is humanized from the participation in and contemplation of art and cultures and other aesthetic hierarchies. And that these contemplations are not leisure vacation activities, but major pursuits among all classes and groups. When Toni Morrison delivered this speech, I was 22. I had failed out of Rutgers once, was readmitted with probationary terms, and eventually would flunk out for good. I had read few books, virtually none for pleasure. My mother would die just a few years later in 1995. And despite a tempestuous relationship with my father, the deteriorating health of my mother, and my troubles in school, I was still DJing. I was still dancing. I was even teaching myself to play some jazz piano. I mean to say, even if I wasn't sitting my ass down in the classroom, I was studying. In fact, I was studying how to study. Now, while my story has many twists and turns, I hope you can start to see the arc of the journey of my imagination. Listening to many histories and gathering with many people from many histories were the foundational principles of my study and my poetics. And yes, I'm talking about poetics as a craft and a process, but I'm also talking about poetics as a means of discovery, as a vehicle for feeling, for wonder itself. By the time I had come to love the books assigned to me by professors, William Blake, Shakespeare, Ishmael Reed, Sandra Cisneros, Amiri Baraka, Anne Sexton, Jessica Hagedorn, the multitudinous story of America and really the world was already in my ear. I learned to read the way I learned to listen to music, open to being moved. This year, we began something called Quilting Water, a public art and archive initiative. It's pretty simple, actually. I drafted an interview made up of 5 questions about water. I was thinking about the New Deal and the federal WPA project, which employed artists and writers to document America. And I thought, why not do it again? This time with the specific goal of gathering stories about water. And this time, what if we made it a point to document the stories from communities who have been historically excluded from contributing to the big story? Furthermore, what if we conducted these interviews in very local spaces, Camden for sure, and other communities in New Jersey that are Black, brown, immigrant, and working class? But what if we also collected interviews from around the world, particularly from regions and communities whose racialization enabled a violent colonial project and the industries that profited from such a project? What would we learn about our relationship to the land and its resources? What would we learn about justice, about storytelling, and therefore literature itself? We're at the very beginning of the collection process. Our team members remind me a lot of the families I grew up with. They are from the various routes of Black America, Asia and the Pacific, the Caribbean. They are members of our own Rutgers community. Alumni have been and continue to be a crucial part of this effort. We've collected a couple dozen interviews, some of which were piloted by writing students from the MFA Creative Writing Program. My colleague Keith Green has assigned his undergraduate students in his AFAM literature class to collect some of the interviews from their families and communities. Friends and colleagues have eagerly volunteered to help plan and collect these water interviews, and we've been able to archive responses from Puerto Rico, Japan, the Philippines, South Africa, and Brussels by way of Somalia and Italy. Most recently, I interviewed an elder from the Atayal, an indigenous tribe of Taiwan who belong to the Austronesian language group, which counts peoples from the Pacific Islands to Southeast Asia, all the way to Madagascar. Of course, we're planning more interviews in Camden, as well as New Brunswick and Newark. I hope we can collect water interviews from the Skylands to the Pine Barrens to Cape May and Gloucester. Before the interviews even began, I had conversations with Renata Merrell, born and raised in Camden and who graduated from our campus in 2019. He's now a grad student at UPenn. And over this past summer, Allende and his father, Tim, took me on a walking tour of Camden, a city they've called home for 3 generations. For me, our conversations, our friendship, has been an extension of a life of imagining, playing, thinking, and studying with other folks that began at an early age for me. We are in the process of becoming caretakers of each other's story. You might be asking, what will happen with the archive of responses we get from the interviews? Well, first of all, this is a project that can go on for as long as we want to support it and continue to do the work. The memories, mythologies, legends, wishes, and dreams for and about water are vast and virtually endless, but there's more. Allende's mother, Renata, is a quilter. And you may know that quilting is a very old African American tradition in the Americas. In fine arts, Gee's Bend has become a well-known center for Black quilting. And the tradition thrives right here in Camden. The ostensible purpose of a quilting community is to make quilts. But what quilters also make is a space for gathering. And in that gathering, the quilters bring food, eat together, They share techniques, they recall stories and memories, they trade jokes, they problem solve and plan, they imagine. What they make, in addition to the quilts themselves, are opportunities to be together. The togetherness, this convergence of solitudes, is the meaning they make. I've been speaking with Renata Merrell since the spring about this. We first met a few years ago when several graduate students, Tajida Chizembua, Abimbola Ige, Arlene Edmonds, and I, designed a community-wide event at the Writers' House that hosted a multiracial, multi-generational audience to participate in the making of a fairly large format graffiti work that elicited stories and dreams of water. Renata and Allende came and participated, and I stayed in touch with the Merrell family since then. I asked Renata if there was something that Rutgers could offer her and her quilting community. What would it be? And she said simply, a place to show our work. So I asked her if she and her quilting community would like to participate in this global water interview project. Would she and the quilters be interested in having access to the stories of water we were gathering from all around the US and really all around the world? And then make quilts in response to them. And she agreed. In a few years, we hope to have gained some momentum in the gathering of interviews locally, nationally, and globally. The quilters will model for us ways of splicing together sources that would otherwise not have been so composed. How to pay attention to material that others find useless. Histories that others might disregard. They model a way of remembering, being, and imagining as a group. They show us something about the convergence of solitude. We have a lot of work ahead of us. As a team, we have logistics to figure out, we have outreach to do, and most importantly, there's the establishment of relationships with the quilters and with the communities around the world who are contributing to this wide-ranging lyric document, this global collaboration. But I think we're off to a great start. I want to end with a quote from Angela Davis. We had a great reading last night with um, the the poets, the writers, and interdisciplinary artists Randall Horton and Krista Franklin. And Krista is a consultant for Quilting Water. She actually has a virtual exhibit right now that was put together by the RCCA. And the exhibit and the reading was programmed in conjunction with an Angela Davis exhibit over at the Zimmerle Art Museum in New Brunswick. And this is the Angela Davis quote, and I believe that she was writing about Palestine. Our histories never unfold in isolation. We cannot truly tell what we consider to be our own histories without knowing the other stories. And often we discover that those other stories are actually our own stories. From Quilting Water, I hope we learn something about feeling. I hope we learn something about contradiction and dissent, about mourning and celebration. I hope we learn something about beauty and storytelling. I hope we learn about history in a way that addresses the deficits in education that Toni Morrison so powerfully pointed out. The elder of the Atayal tribe told me that if we go for a walk and listen, really listen, we can hear nature speaking to us. Quilting water is an opportunity to listen to one another. And each of us is a part of the land we were born into and walk upon. We're listening to the water, and we're listening to the earth. So I don't know how we're doing on time. Let's see, it's 1:23. Here's what I'd love to do. I think that we're going till 1:45. I'm gonna finish with one poem, just because I want to keep everybody dancing in your seats. and and then, if there's I think that we'll make some time for Q&A. This last poem is called A Scavenger's Ode to the Turntable, aka A Note to Thomas Alva Edison. I try not to do too long of an introduction for my poems, but I think this poem pertains to you'll hear it pertains to a lot of the things that I was talking about in my lecture. But there's a couple of things that I want to point out, especially for folks who are from and live in New Jersey. One is that I grew up in Edison, and it's named after the inventor Thomas Edison, who of course invented the light bulb. Our last house was just a bike ride away from where he invented the light bulb, and also he invented what would eventually become the turntable. Now, as you heard in my talk, it came up in the 70s and 80s and the 90s, and I was part of a DJ crew. And one of the ways that we used to DJ is we used to take, because we couldn't afford the sort of expensive turntables that we used to battle, we bought the cheaper turntables and we took them apart. We destroyed them, and then we rebuilt them to suit our purposes. And our purposes really were to make music, and that hopefully that music would help people dance. What people don't know about Thomas Edison was that he was pro-imperialist. There's a great scholar named Christine Balance from Cornell University who talks about this idea of double listening that Filipinos used during the American occupation. And some of it is an analysis of the material culture of that era. And you could see photos of Filipinos sort of listening to these recordings out of this recording machine, the turntable, the record, what would become the record player. And it's a kind of, there's a kind of implication of obedience. And Christine talks about the kind of double listening, or the inherent resistance in the process of listening during this era, and how sound played a part. Now, as you know, if you go to Camden, RCA is right down the road from my office, and Christine talks about the RCA dog listening to his master's voice, and you see the parallels between sort of master and mascot, and the kinds of attitudes about Filipinos during this colonial era at the turn of the 19th and 20th century. Anyway, I don't usually like to lecture about a poem, but I needed to give a context and let you know how it was connected to the talk. So this is called A Scavenger's Ode to the Turntable, aka A Note to Thomas Alva Edison. And I'm going to sing a little bit, whether you like it or not. A 2 turntables and a mic. I want fat MC on the set. A 2 turntables and a mic. I want fat MC on the set. A 2 turntables, one fat MC. A 2 turntables and a mic. I want fat MC on the set. We lifted the precious arm first, then the platter. We pulled free the belt and unscrewed the top. I didn't take shop or build a whole lot by hand, but I was pretty good with a knife. I poked the half dull blade clean and gentle through the turntable's plastic. I sawed down 4 inches straight as I could make it. Me and my boys, sons of cops, bookkeepers, and ex-priests, picked up gear other DJs didn't want no more. One prep school kid who just bought a shiny new mixer tossed his 2-month-old Newmark, which we picked from the garbage and hoisted home. We harvested the slider from the rich kid's rig. I stripped the wires tips and soldered them to pitch contacts in a basement of a maple split in Edison, New Jersey. We were learning to turn anything into anything else, while our mothers played mahjong in the sala and our fathers bet slow horses and the government bombed Iraq. We learned to poise pennies on the cartridge head so the diamond stylus would sit deep in the vinyl's groove. A dance floor could turn from whining to riot quick if a record skipped when we spun back the wax to its cue. We stayed awake from noon to noon, digging out from crates some forgotten voice or violin to scratch. We juggled and chirped. We perfected the grind of a downbeat and dropped it on the bass line, coming round half trash, half hallelujah. Our hands cut Bach to Bambata and made a dance hall jump. We held one ear to the syncopated kick and the other to a future music that no one else could hear. Out of a hunk of rescued junk, we built a machine to mix the classics. We faded and transformed. We chopped up masters and made the whole block bounce. 2 turntables and a mic. I want fat MC on the set. 2 turntables and a mic. I want fat MC on the set. 2 turntables, 1 fat MC, 2 turntables and a mic. I want fat MC on the set. That's it, y'all. Thank you for coming out. I don't know if somebody's going to interject at this point and sort of talk about the Q&A, but
Well, thank you so much, Professor Rosal. That was just incredibly inspiring and so interesting. And thank you so much for giving your talk. To move on to the question and answer session, please type your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will be asking Professor Rosal, your questions. So I'm going to start out with one. Your reading of your poems is very striking. So is the performance of your poems part of your writing process?
yeah, I think that I get asked about that a lot, and I think in terms of quilting water, it draws on my performance background. The idea performance itself is a nod to ritual. Performance is literature in ritual. And so when I talk about my father being a former Catholic priest, he was a great preacher, orator, and I certainly inherited that. And so the other part of a performance, I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's still denigrated, because people think that if you can perform, it means you're making up for some deficit in writing, but that's not the case at all. Performance, the kinds of listening, the kinds of imagining, the kinds of reading, the kinds of literacy of the body that it takes, it definitely is a part. You have to use your ear and your body in order to be able to sort of see and sense and read and revise the text that you're composing. And then the performance itself becomes a kind of recomposition, a remix, a revision of the text that's on the page. So certainly the performance aspect of it is it's not just kind of an expression of a text, but it's a continuous rediscovering of what the text is saying and what the possibilities of the text might be, given the audience as we move from as the text moves from audience to audience. It's why, like, when they perform like Shakespeare plays, it's different every time, so Yeah, it's definitely the short answer is yes. That it's it's a huge part of my whole process.
Awesome. So one of the questions that came in while you were speaking is related to the water project. So we often associate the lack of clean drinking water with distant continents and countries. But as we've seen over the last few years, predominantly Black and brown areas in US cities like Flint, Newark, and other places lack clean drinking water. So will the Quilting Water Project also look at this domestic issue?
Absolutely, it's already started. That's why I'm having these conversations with folks in Camden to begin with, and there's the idea. In one of the sort of really beautiful, so many incredible interviews that we've already gathered. One of them, I interviewed Christina Alifara, who's a novelist and a poet, who's of Somalian descent. She was actually born in Italy because her father was an immigrant to Italy, and then she grew up in Mogadishu, and now she lives in Brussels. But she talks about needing to be close to the water in order to pray. That she goes to the canals, even though it's not the ocean, because she knows that all of the waters connects us. She talks about the waters being like veins that connect all of us, and I immediately thought of Camden. I immediately thought of Newark. I immediately thought of Flint in our borderlands, and I certainly thought of right here in my hometown of Rahway, New Jersey. Like over this summer, as we were collecting these interviews, Hurricane Ida had hit. So we're talking about climate for sure, but we're also talking about water quality. And so one of the things that we're doing is sort of making connections to folks in all these different communities across the country and around the world to gather what their memories and their observations and their dreams of water are.
Okay, so another question from the attendees is, from the interviews conducted so far, are there any similarities or differences in the beauties or struggles in the stories shared?
There's a lot of parallels. I mean, I think that one thing that I anticipated, but seeing the specifics of it is really beautiful. Is um, seeing all the different ways that water manifests itself as a mythological subject, but also appears in personal memory. And the convergence of those two things in so many of the interviews to me is really similar. I think that, as you might expect with a subject like water, one of the things that's sort of popped up in this early moment of collecting the interviews is um, there is a sense of wonder about what water is. There's a sense of memory, historical memory. The Middle Passage, of course, was on my mind when I was designing Quilting Water. Um, and there's also a sense of there's an elegiac sense about water, and the worry that water as a living thing, we have not sort of paid attention to it or treated it well. And so what we're seeing now is really a result of this disconnect that we have had as a sort of global culture with this fundamental um, resource is not even the right word, but this element of life itself. So that all those themes are run through the interviews for sure.
I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. So this actually came in a couple times. Is there an opportunity for the community to get involved in your project?
Absolutely. You can email me at, I don't know if you want to put this in the chat, but patrick.rosal@rutgers.edu. We're sort of there's been so much interest in this from students to alums to just like friends of mine. And we're trying to figure out the best ways to sort of like get people involved. Probably the biggest need that will be coming up over the next few months and over the course of the academic year are people to conduct interviews. You know, like, this is such an easy process. All you need is your phone or a voice recorder or a computer or a tablet, and you just go and you take these 5 questions with you and you record either by video or audio what somebody's answers are. I encourage people to conduct interviews across difference. So that's across racial difference, across ability, across gender, across generation, across geography. That's really one of the things that we're trying to do with Quilting Water. So I think this is like one of the things too, is like, we don't want to own this project. Is that we want to send these questions out in the world, and people are going to do what they want. They can send the responses back and have them archived inside the archive. That it can make art out of them. They can make a curriculum out of this. What we want to do is send out this tool that doesn't belong to anybody. Water doesn't belong to anybody. These questions, our sense of wonder, our hopes, our memories, our mythologies, water don't belong to anybody. And so everybody can sort of engage in this activity and in this effort. So I encourage people to write to me, to pop into the to the Institute's webpage. I'm hoping that, probably in the next 6 months or so, we'll be developing a web page so that people can be updated. They might even be able to see and listen to some of the clips, which I'm so excited about. And there will certainly be calls for people to be involved in various ways in terms of the Quilting Water Project all across.
Thank you so much. I think we might just squeeze one more quick question in. There's so many wonderful questions in the Q&A, and I wish we had more time. That I invite those of you interested in Patrick's project to please, use his email address and reach out. It looks like there's some ideas that are Camden related that sound really wonderful. I'm sure Patrick would love to speak with you about it. So the final question, for as long as I've known you, you've challenged traditional notions of what qualifies as a text and what should be respected as an archive. Can you speak a little to your personal philosophy regarding this, both as a poet and academic?
I cannot reconcile the strict hierarchies of books and publishing to my experience of beauty, storytelling, music, and gathering. They aren't mutually exclusive, but I've experienced so much wonder, so much healing, so much awe, disorientation from listening to people tell stories on the stoop or on the corner or at the bar or at a family party or on the dance floor. And I feel lucky that my training as a poet and my background as a dancer and as a musician and as a performer has opened up my attention to these texts that seem to disappear, that are very much like performances. And so as a scholar, one of the things that I'm really interested in is the literature that apparently disappears, where the exact words or the exact form or the exact mechanics of the artifact, whether that's the painting, the dance, the movie, that those things can't always capture these other forms and these other interactions. And so I'm constantly open to the ways that people are singing, to the way that people are mourning and celebrating. And they are informal ways. There are ways that have organic forms. They have ways that have not been tabulated or have passed through the kinds of gatekeeping mechanisms that we have in publishing and academia. And so I think that I think given my sort of past in the church and on the street and in the clubs, that I really have no choice but to think, in a very fluid way about the ways that we remember, the way that we mourn, the way that we celebrate, and the way that we gather.
Thank you so much, Professor Rosal. I would now like to turn it over to Mary Claire Venuto, who is Rutgers Camden's Acting Director for the Office of Alumni Engagement and Annual Giving.
Thank you, Amy. On behalf of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences in Camden and the Rutgers University Alumni Association, I want to thank Professor Rosal for sharing and sometimes singing his poetry and how it prepared him to think about racial justice. It really was quite captivating. I also want to thank everyone in the audience for being with us today. Everybody will be receiving a follow-up email shortly, which will include a survey to provide feedback. This is the 4th event in the Scarlet Scholars series, but it won't be the last. Watch your email for more fascinating events this academic year. Take care, and we hope to see you at a future event soon. Thank you.
Hey, Pat, I don't know if, are we still on?
Yeah, I could hear you.
No, just want to say thanks. It's just tremendous.
Well,
A real highlight.
well, I was nervous up until this
Oh,
morning.
no.
I was putting the finishing touches on this morning. There's probably like 10 different drafts that ended up
Oh.
in the trash, but I think this one turned out okay. I just want to say, Howard, I thanks so much for this opportunity for me to to think through this work and this kind of long trajectory.
Mhm.
And yeah, just yeah, I was happy to share it.
Yeah,
Really.
that's great. I think it's fantastic. So I'm looking forward to continuing the work going forward.
Absolutely, and thank you everybody else for putting this together and supporting the program.
You bet. Thanks again.
All right,
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care, everybody.
Thanks.
a great one.
You were incredible. That was just amazing. All
Thanks so much.
Captivating.
Thank you.
Captivating.
right, take care.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.